that's exactly what teachers and healthcare workers are doing when they're going on strike. They're essentially saying, we are here for you 24/7, and we're showing you that we're desperate. We're hitting a point where like we need to save the system. And this is also how, from the side of the Common Front, the strike was framed. We're trying to actually save the education sector and the healthcare sector, and we're trying to maintain them in a way that functions for people, right? And of course, like then, like the language that is always used on the other side is, we're trying to make it so that the needs of the population are met.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Colin Dansaba. I'm here with a returning guest. Some of you might recognize him, Felix Fox. How are you doing?
Good. How have you been?
Not too bad, not too bad. It's summer now. It's getting warmer, as are the labor issues, it seems.
Indeed, things are definitely heating up.
Yeah. Last time I had Felix on, he came to talk about the absolutely massive common front strikes happening here in Quebec. That was in the fall of 2023, and I brought him back because he's witnessing, keeping eye on the fallout, the ripples from that. Felix is a college teacher and course lecturer. He is organized as a member of the Dawson Teachers Union of the Fédération nationale des enseignantes et des enseignants du Québec, organized by the CSN. Is that right, Felix?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Sometimes it's I have difficulty keeping track of the unions, which are on top of the unions, which are
Yeah.
organized other
It's. I
unions.
mean, I'm also. I mean, I'm mainly working at Dawson at the moment. That's the one that's getting a little bit more stable. But as things are like in that sort of precarious position of trying to build a career in education, you're usually teaching at a couple of different places. I think I'm always with CSN, but I'm in a couple of different unions at the same time.
Incredible! You got a foot in every door.
Yes, indeed.
So, Felix, just today you're telling me you're at a town hall at Dawson. Can you tell me why this town hall was significant to you and why you wanted to attend?
Yes, so it's the second town hall that they've hosted on the matter of austerity and budget cuts from the Quebec government. The first one took place in November, I believe. The reason why it's a concern warranting a town hall at my institution is because they're essentially implementing pretty massive cuts to um, staffing, not teachers. They're exempt as in education. They can't really exactly reduce like the people that are directly interacting with students, but they're basically forcing CEGEPs across the sector, not just Dawson, to make cuts in their support staff. And as someone at the town hall in the question and answer period at the end kind of pointed out, I think it was actually Louisa Hadley, the president of Dawson Teachers Union, it's oftentimes sort of portrayed as an issue that like the support staff are the ones that suffer and the teachers are the ones that are safe here. But of course, like cutting support staff puts more work on the teachers, which of course, like besides destroying jobs and livelihoods, also like massively cuts the education sector as a whole, because more work for teachers means less time that you can spend on the students, which means a decrease in the quality of education, which is obviously the craziest part of this, because whenever you're talking about austerity and budget cuts, especially in healthcare and education, you're essentially talking about governments shooting themselves in the foot because they're essentially preventing future workers from being better prepared for more efficient participation in the economy. And on the other hand, you're preventing them from getting the care that they need while they're unemployed.
Mm, mm. So, what is it exactly that the support staff are in charge of? What are they responsible for? That's going to put a bigger burden on teachers.
So support staff have, I mean, they're quite literally everywhere. They're
Mm-hmm.
in the print shop. They're in social services for the students. They're in the library. They're in the dining hall. there is security for the college. Everyone who's working in the college is essentially in one of three categories: administration, support staff, or teaching, student-facing positions. Support staff, for example, also includes some positions that aren't really, I don't think they're rubriced under the envelope of teaching staff or student-facing staff, but they're part of support staff. And that's, for example, the Academic Skills Center in our library that is actually meant to kind of like help students deal with their workload, help with their assignments.
Okay, so you're telling me that with these cuts going to the support staff, the government is saying that the teachers are safe, or some people are saying the teachers are safe, but in fact, because the support staff is being cut, these teachers are going to have even more burdens, even more responsibilities then.
Yeah, which is not to say that, I mean, the biggest burden is still shouldered by the support staff, right? Like they are the ones that are facing job cuts, layoffs. I think I have the numbers here from the town hall. I believe I wrote it down here somewhere. I think in support staff, there's a cut of 7.6%. They cut 5% in management or in administration as well, not exactly managers, but that can take various forms, right? It can be cuts, it can be displacement within the college, that you're kind of like taken out of your current role and put in another role, which oftentimes results in essentially layoffs, or it can mean that someone who retires is simply the position is simply left empty and they're not replacing it with anyone, which of course is a sort of neat way for the government to get rid of a position without improving the services in any way, right? So extraordinary burden on the support staff. There are a lot of people. You could feel the anxiety in the room. And I think it's reflective of what's going on more broadly speaking in the CEGEP sector, more broadly speaking in education, whether it's college or university, and of course in the healthcare sector and the public sector more generally speaking, because this is all sort of, I think the town hall was sort of hosted under the banner of budgetary situation and austerity. And that's the broader attack that public services are currently facing in Quebec. And as you pointed out before, this is the reason why I'm happy to be back, is because this is essentially, in a lot of ways, the ripple effects and the clawback of the government, essentially the punishing of the working population for having defended some of its gains, ensured adjustment for inflation in the Common Front strikes in 2023, 2024. So essentially, the current measures are basically coming just on just after the most recent contract has been signed, just after all the back pay has been wrapped up. This is when immediately the government came in and decided now it's time to cut, right? And of course, the idea is always, like when you're talking about austerity regimes, the idea is always the same. The objective of the government is to balance the budget. That is the sort of like banner that everyone's familiar with, and immediately makes sense to people. Well, okay, if you yourself have an unbalanced household, of course you're trying to reduce your debt. Of course you're trying to get back into positive numbers in your bank account. But that's of course not really how governments work, right? Governments need to run deficits. Any economist will tell you this. Actually, not every economist, but the good ones will tell you that a government is not a regular household, right? And a government is also not a company. A government needs to run a deficit in order to ensure the functioning of the state. It's not a for-profit venture, and accordingly, you can't run it like that. But of course, that's what under austerity regimes governments are trying to do. What are they trying to do? Balance the budget. How are they trying to do it? Well, they have two options. Either they increase taxes, either they try to kind of bring in more revenue in order to deal with the deficit, or they reduce the size of the public sector, which can mean money, and which now also, especially for the support staff at places like Dawson, means reducing the number of employees. So far, they've only come after building budgets, maintenance budgets. Now they're coming after people's jobs.
Wow, wow. So from
And
what?
and by the way, like balancing the budget is one thing here. They're also essentially trying to improve the bond rating of Quebec so that they can get more money from investors.
Of course, of course. So as you you're laying out a lot here, but just so I understand, so from what we saw, in terms of gains from workers during the 2023 phone commercial, you're telling me that these kinds of cuts, these little mm, mm, budget, I guess, yeah, cuts, austerity that we're seeing in the CEGEP sector, this is a sort of, I guess, like a strike back from the gains won during the Common Front. Is that it?
Yeah. And I mean, like I can back that up with other things that you can see is going on because for starters, who are they currently coming after in terms of trying to claw back money to stuff the deficit? They're not, as I said, they're not increasing taxes, right? They're not coming after their donors. They're not
Mm-hmm.
coming after big corporations. They're not coming after the private sector. Who are they coming after? They're coming after the majority of people that made up the Common Front strikes. They're coming after education and they're coming after healthcare. And then in addition to that, they're also the reason why I say this is a disciplinary measure, an economic measure that's waging a war against the working class more broadly speaking, but also a specific disciplinary measure for organized workers that made demands during the 2023 strike wave is that you have at the same time bills like Bill 89 being discussed in Quebec Parliament, which is a bill that is essentially specifically targeting essential workers going on strike. This bill is quite literally sort of like drawn up as and has been sort of like defended by the minister in charge of it as a sort of measure to prevent people from being impacted by labor actions. And that, of course, on paper sounds good. And they stuff in plenty of bad sounding examples like school buses being impacted by strikes or special needs students not being able to get support during strikes of teachers. But these are all made in bad faith. What it is essentially is it's meant to take away the leverage of public sector unions because, of course, they ended up getting a large share of what they were asking the government to give them, which was essentially not even an increase of wages, but essentially just the bare minimum of adjusting for inflation and
Mm-hmm.
protecting workers' wages in education and healthcare and the public sector more generally speaking for the foreseeable future with inflation on increasing on the horizon. And what they're now trying to do is they're trying to essentially exactly like fight back as what they kind of got through this process of education that they underwent with the 2023 Common Front strikes. They realized, oh, we have to actually give them some of what they're asking for because they have a massive impact. They
Mm-hmm.
take care of people's children. They, without them, society comes to a halt and
Mm-hmm.
stops functioning the way that it normally does, so that other people see how important it is to maintain these sectors. And now they're essentially trying to push back against that by saying, well, how do we solve that? Well, we solve that by essentially undermining the ability of these workers to show how essential they are.
Right, right. It's the classic thing of. I mean, I feel like I saw this all the time in at least during the pandemic, especially. Right, there's a huge labor
Yeah,
question of which workers are essential. Right, I remember the dock workers went on strike, and the port authority who was in charge of employing them or giving them money was saying no, they should not. We should not be allowing them to go on strike. We should not be allowing them to have these gains and have try to leverage for these gains because they are essential workers, right? So you see that kind of language being used
yeah.
again here. I want to
And
talk.
it's of course like the unions have been very like smartly using that because this was essentially during the pandemic a slip of tongue
Mm-hmm,
of those in power. They pointed out, well, if you got to stay in your job because you guys are essential,
mm-hmm,
and the unions took from that. Well, turns out we are essential.
mm-hmm,
Turns out teachers and nurses and doctors and garbage collectors and shop clerks are actually the people that really keep day-to-day operations running. And now we're kind of seeing the turnaround where governments like the CAQ, like the cut government, are essentially saying, well, looks like they may be essential, but it's more essential that we keep them in line.
Mm. It's interesting that it's true. I never considered that the whole thing about it being essential work, right? Well, it's on one hand they're trying to make an argument towards like, no, we can't like have these people whatever leave or have shut this down because this is essential, right? Inadvertently gives unions and I guess workers more,
Yeah.
at least more leverage, right? At least rhetorical leveraging. I
And
want to
it's
talk.
it's it's funny too because it's sorry, last point.
No
It's
worries,
just
no worries.
all these like classic labor slogans are just time and again proven right. I love doing this with students. I try to show them that like sometimes these really what we think of as incredibly complex ideas are actually very smartly broken down by classic labor slogans. And one famous one is of course, and here we see with the slip of tongue of the essential worker that power knows this, and the working classes may be the ones that need to be reminded of this, which is capital needs labor, labor does not need capital.
There you go. And there you have it. I mean, I'm a big fan of slogans. I'm a big fan of the ability to really distill something into its just core essence of truth, you know. Um anyways, that's besides the point. I want to talk a bit about Bill 89 exactly. So this is I'm going to read
Yeah.
from this article I have here. This is from the CBC, published February 19th, 2025. Quebec unions, opposition parties decry bill that would force striking employees back to work. If passed, bill would ensure minimum services are maintained in schools and municipalities. Quebec Labor Minister Jean Boulet has tabled a bill aimed at maintaining certain public services in the case of a labor conflict. Boulet told reporters at the National Assembly Wednesday that Bill 89 gives more consideration to the needs of the population. I'm kind of curious what you think about that statement.
Well, it's that's what I said, what I meant before when I said that this is made in bad faith,
Mm-hmm.
because we already saw that during the 2023 strikes. What was the language that they used, or how did they, in public, in front of the press, try to appeal to workers and appeal to the unions? They said, think of the children, think
Mm-hmm.
of the patients, and of course like the nobody like ever like puts it out in public like as a labor minister that that's exactly what teachers and healthcare workers are doing when they're going on strike. They're essentially
24/7.
saying we are here for
Mm-hmm.
you 24/7, and we're showing you that we're desperate, we're hitting a point where like we need to save the system. And this is also how from the side of the common front the strike was framed. We're trying to actually save the education sector and the healthcare sector, and we're trying to maintain them in a way that functions for people, right? And of course, like then, like the language that is always used on the other side is we're trying to make it so that the needs of the population are met. You see this in other instances. For example, the Conservative Party makes a big deal in Canada of supporting workers, boots not suits, and all this stuff. And at the same time, they're running with an official party platform that includes right to work legislation. Same strategy. Right to work legislation sounds great on paper.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants to be able to make a living. Everybody wants to have a job, and everybody wants like guarantees that you can make a living in a country like Canada. What right to work legislation, of course, really means is that they're giving back money to workers by allowing them to opt out of union dues, which of course undercuts like the funds that unions can raise for the
Mm-hmm.
event of a strike, which undercuts the length a strike can take, which undercuts collective bargaining rights.
Right, right. I think I mean, there's so many interesting things going on with this bill where you see these things coming to, I guess, continuing to progress along, right? As we saw with what you're saying before about the rhetoric used around essential work during COVID. Now we have what I'm reading here in this article. You have Jean Boulet who said he was inspired, or at least he wants the provincial government to have similar powers to the federal government when the federal government returned striking postal workers back to work. Right now, this is when you see, I guess, like the this kind of ideological front kind of forming, right? There's it's not really a question, it's not quite a question like it used to be of like sovereignty versus federalism. Now you have just kind of right wingers at the provincial level, right wingers at the federal level, both kind of uniting behind these same tactics, right? I mean, we saw this again with the port workers as well. I think one of
Yeah,
my I think
and
this always.
I was looking at that article before the interview as well, and that bit is quite striking in the context of Quebec, right? Saying that we're inspired what the feds can do with crown corporations like Canada Post, and I mean that already, like, that's not an example that you should desire to follow.
Mm-hmm.
Just this is and this is interestingly enough also showing us that yes, this is in a way like a direct response of the Quebec provincial government to striking workers in Quebec, but it's also part of a larger shift towards austerity in Canada, more broadly speaking, where you see that it's essentially like the choice to be given is between the Conservatives and the Liberals in Canada at the moment, that we were given recently at the ballot box, is essentially a choice between getting shot or getting poisoned,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's either the slow decline of like trying to balance the budget with like tax raises that are not really doing the trick, and at the same time just trying to kind of like claw back money in the budget through austerity measures under a liberal government, or it's the complete destruction of for economic reasons and for ideological reasons of the conservatives of
Mm-hmm.
entire institutions within the government. You see the extreme version of that currently happening in the United States, where they're quite literally taking apart the education ministry as a way of saying we need to save money, so let's cut the jobs of the people that educate people who make
Mm-hmm.
money.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the future of Quebec and Canadian politics when you look down south to the states?
I mean, I hope that my in-laws and the extended Italian family doesn't watch this, because I'm going to be persona non grata if I say that this is starting to make me feel like borderline like separatist sentiments.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, separatism in this case is not really a solution either for Quebec, because if you separate Quebec from Canada under a CAQ government or even a PQ government, you're going to get the same austerity policies. A left wing government could use a separated Quebec in order to implement things like modern monetary theory, where the
Mm-hmm.
idea is that, well, if you're in charge, if you're printing your own money, you have a very different handle on inflation. You have a very different handle on how you fund your services and how you run your budgets. This is, if anything, what's shining through with Boulay here a little bit, the desire that Quebec can act more sovereigntist within, more independent within the broader framework of Canada, because they're essentially realizing that in order to deal with some of these things that the Quebec government is trying to deal with, you need these sort of like broader abilities to kind of like step on people's neck, for lack of a better phrase. This escalated a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
it's an escalating situation. So I think
No, absolutely.
escalating language can be excused.
As you're more than forgiven for that. I think I know. I mean, even the president has, I think, not really been careful about his language down there. So I
Yeah.
think we can be excused to be a little crude ourselves.
I
Um,
mean, it's kind of like Warren Buffett once said, right? The left is right when they're saying there's a class war. It's only that my class, the rich, are waging it, and you
mhm.
guys are losing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the situation we're currently in.
Thank you, billionaire Warren Buffett, for the
Yeah,
sharp analysis.
even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Of course, of course. I think there's something interesting about the last time I had you on talking about the Common Front strikes, where you made this appeal that these strikes are. I think there's a way that people try to, I guess, dilute the scope of these strikes, right? I think this is something you see a lot in kind of like Canadian media, Quebecois media, where people talk about these strikes as sort of a level of a moment of selfishness, right, by these kind of striking
Yeah,
workers. And you see this right now with this Bill 89 stuff, with Jean Boulet saying that, like, these teachers, they're not thinking about the poor students. These bus drivers are not thinking about the students. But these education workers are not thinking about these students with special needs, But what you said in that episode, which is so, I think, inspirational and kind of, I think, and it gives a picture of the actual leverage these kinds of strikes have. Was that these strikes, especially at the public level? I mean, these strikes, the Common Front strikes, are like some of the largest I had seen in my lifetime. This is not just a thing to gain workers some level of uh, uh, higher pay, more benefits. Of course, that's part of it,
yeah,
but it's also a level. It's also a tool to secure more social goods, more social services, right, for the broader population.
yeah.
And I think it's so telling that with those kinds of little victories, with that kind of tool being used in the common front strikes, you have the cat government trying to whittle away at that tool, right? Trying to make those kinds of tools
Yeah.
less powerful, trying to make it that people can use them even less with this kind of bill. Um, I know there's been in the National Assembly, there's been some question of constitutionality with the bill. You have Alexandre Leduc, who's the Quebec Solidar's labor critic, questioning whether or not this would be challenged. Actually, he wasn't really
Yeah.
questioning it. He was almost promising that this is something that could
Yeah, it's
easily
going
be
to lead
challenged in
to
the court.
lawsuits further down the line.
Right, right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's as I said before, right? It's part of a broader pattern of an attack on working people, on the majority of Canadians. What governments like the CEQ are doing with these austerity measures, and it's. I mean, this is the kind of really bothersome part of all this. Like you're at a common strike protest and you're listening to the speeches there. I remember one thing that stuck out to me was that one of the main organizers of the CSN pointed out to the crowd, like the government went in on television yesterday and said the CSN, like they just need to come to the table and they need to come talk to us. And they pointed out we're here 24/7. If we're not at the table, it's because the CAQ is not asking us to sit down, right? And that's exactly the aggravating thing there. You're blamed for not caring about your students, not caring about your patients, when the reason why a lot of these strikes are happening is because people, yes, it's about pay, but it's also simply about the ability to do your job, which is increasingly being, as you said, whittled away at.
Hmm.
The cuts now at Dawson, for example, the austerity budget includes, I think, like something like a total of what was it, $151 million compression in the entire network, where they're basically trying to cut funds. Like for Dawson, it comes out to I think $5 million of cuts. This is quite substantial, right?
Hmm.
Like it comes with a hiring freeze, it comes with job losses, it comes with cuts in the operating budget, which means day-to-day functions. It comes with a recent cut in capital budget, which means you can forget about building extensions. You can forget about new equipment. You can forget about building maintenance. I see it everywhere. I'm involved in Dawson Teachers Union. I'm on the executive council as the representative for the English department. I'm also on a committee of a new program for math, computer sciences, and science more generally. They set up a new program last year, and essentially, like half a year in, they realized that they cut the budget. They can't buy new equipment. They can't do the things that you're meant to do when you're setting up a new program.
Hmm.
And that, of course, like the concerning thing for me is that the way that it's sort of sold to the public and the way that a lot of people think about it, because that's all they hear in the media, which is why I'm incredibly grateful for the job that you're doing, like trying to get that the counter narrative out, if you will. All that they hear is, well, we got to make sure that the budget is balanced. Or if it's about the strike, well, we got to make sure that they care about the people that they're supposed to care about, their patients and their students. The real reason why people are going to fight against austerity, why they're going to strike for better wages and better working conditions with the Common Front is because they think about their students, because they think about their patients, because you cannot do your job right if with like shrinking of support staff and shrinking of the general budget of an institution, your class sizes keep increasing, the students
Hmm.
need more help from you as a teacher. There's fewer beds to go around, which means that nurses have to deal with overcrowding. Like all of these ripple effects are put on the workers, and they're essentially kind of like scolded twice. They're scolded once by the government for saying like, well, you don't care about your patients or your students, and on the other hand, they're scolded. Why can't you do more with less?
Well, well, I mean, it's just the classic story we always hear about. It's this thing
Yeah,
of It's this thing of squeezing these the social services, public services, these institutions until there's just absolutely nothing left. And then, of course, the solution that they're going to pitch is that we have to privatize. Look,
Yeah,
these public institutions aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Never mind our cuts, but I guess now it's time to just completely gut the system and just let the private sector take over.
yeah.
And then through that, it's going to be
If
even harder I guess protect that kind of I don't know, this
Yeah,
idea
yeah,
of
of
like
course.
public health and public good.
And for that matter, I mean, you're seeing the extreme version of that because it's just been accelerated tenfold compared to Canada and in the United States right
Mm-hmm.
now, right? The reason why they can get away with doing what they're doing in the United States is because they've essentially put so much stress on their population and they've overworked them to such a degree and undereducated them that people simply don't have the tools or the time or the energy to fight back against this. And this is exactly why they're coming after unions in Canada, because it's the same essential project. It's always the same concept that austerity operates under. It's balancing the budget, but the real thing here is reshaping the economy to privatize it.
Mm-hmm.
I think I may have mentioned this before. Anyone who feels like I need an economics degree to kind of understand what's going on here, I'm not an anarchist. I'm a Marxist, but this is a particularly useful sort of teaching text. I can highly recommend. It's available for free on YouTube. That people watch Noam Chomsky's Requiem for the American Dream. He talks about varying austerity regimes that have developed in the states since the 1980s, and he makes a similar point as the one that you just made, which is what is going on here is that essentially um, if you're trying to privatize a part of the public sector, how do you do that? You make the service work less well. How do you do that? Through budget cuts, through cuts in the staffing, until these services function to such in such a bad way, don't really fulfill people's needs anymore, so that people get mad at them. You see that
Mm-hmm.
currently going on for years now with the Canadian healthcare system. They're underfunding it. They're cutting in Quebec. I think they're trying to make up for $1.5 billion of deficit. And how are they going to do that? Well, by making it work even worse, at which point people are going to get fed up, at which point they're going to suggest privatizing it, at which point it's going to work better for people with money, and it's going to work even worse for the people who don't have money but also don't have a voice. So the problem is out of sight, and they no longer have to care about it.
What is there to do about all this?
Well, if you want to go with pithy slogans, one solution, revolution, right?
Right.
In the absence of any sustained revolutionary moment right now, union organizing is one of the ways in which you can kind of fight back against these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Strengthening democratic structures, demanding that politicians care about the people that they're supposed to care about, right? They want us to care about our students and nurses to care about their patients. We already do. And maybe they should start caring about students too. Maybe they
Mm-hmm.
should start genuinely caring about patients in the healthcare sector, overworked doctors, overworked nurses, the working population of Canada. If they did that, that would be one way of fixing it. Of course, that's not going to happen because governments in the West generally have been completely captured by business and this business ideology of privatizing public services.
Mm-hmm.
The thing to do, or the way to fight back currently, is through unions. The unions, especially in Canada, they still have a pull. You could see that too, right? Like there's ripple effects on the opposing side in the aftermath of the Common Front strikes. There were also positive ripple effects on the other side of this. Striking workers, be it Canada Post, be it dock workers, be it public sector employees asking for higher wages, they took their clue, and even in the private sector, they took their clue from the fact that the Common Front fought and won adjustments for inflation.
Mm-hmm.
That had a positive effect for others, unionized or not, in Quebec and in the rest of Canada, because every time unionized workers gain, those gains are going to be have to be caught up on by the private sector.
It raises the ceiling of possibility.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you're saying before about the common front strikes. Sort of like, of course, there's the actual direct uh resources that they're trying to like gain for their institutions, their respective institutions. But there's also those that kind of, I guess, that completely detached, but just kind of other workers get to see what's possible, right? Other
Yeah.
workers get to see, oh, you can actually get together, you can be this enormous force, and the government will bow down, and
Yeah.
they will absolutely compromise and meet you at where you are.
Absolutely. And I mean, with that, as you said, right, like meet you at where you are, unions haven't even begun to kind of like ask for more than the sort of like bare minimum
Hmm.
wage increases and whatnot. The common front, where it comes from, and I've written an article, if I can pitch that for Jacobin and for People's Voice on this matter, like where does the common front come from? It comes originally from the 1970s. The first common front actually fought and won a lot of the things that are still seen as rights today in Quebec, minimum wage, and they, for being just one example, and they had a much wider vision that unions weren't just fighting for wage increases or caps or something like that, but unions were generally meant to fight for the public good, for public services. This is the language that in a very fortunate shift, like lately unions have been really trying to use, that the public, I think, is more open to ever since the sort of language shift of
Hmm.
the essential worker during the pandemic. There's an opening now for increased union organizing and increased union militancy. I think if like nothing else, like militancy more broadly speaking, but especially in the union sector, is one way in which you can successfully fight austerity regimes through.
Right. I mean, there's so much I want to go off of that. But I mean, I think in terms of these kinds of gains, that's something I think when I was first becoming more, I guess, like radicalized and more aware of these kinds of different of the things I just took for granted, right? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, there's all these as growing up, becoming a member of the labor force. There's these things I had, right, and I'm like, I have weekends, I have vacation, a maximum 8 hour workday for most
yeah,
sectors, right? And these are, I'm like, yeah, sure, this makes sense. It's all well and good. And then I learn about things like the Haymarket, like riots, right, where like
yeah,
people were killed for striking, rioting about an 8 hour workday, right? And that's one of those moments I was like, oh, wait a minute. The floor I'm standing on, the rights I
yeah,
have, the protections I have as a worker is like this was not just something that was given, right? This is something I was fought for, that people actually spilled blood over. And
yeah, absolutely.
it's interesting hearing about the. I think there's something to the fact that right now you're seeing labor unions and a lot of labor movements here in Canada and Quebec are sort of asking for the bare minimum, right? But there's this kind of like, it sounds like there's this kind of potential awakening of maybe
Yeah.
of people realizing the actual leverage that they have collectively.
Yeah, I think, I mean, and I think like there's various ways in which various groups try to organize people within the labor movement, or broadly speaking in society, social movements that are kind of waking up to these things as well.
Hmm.
The unfortunate reality is it doesn't happen by itself,
Of
right?
course.
From nothing comes nothing, which means that if people are wondering like what can you do in order to fight against austerity, in order to make things better, um, get involved in renters unions, get involved in labor union, organize your workplace, get involved in political organizations, get involved in neighborhood organizations. It's the organizing bit that's really important. The
Hmm.
this usually people forget about this during the elections because they kind of engage with the political process every 4 years, but you're actually, especially in a place like Canada or the United States, incredibly disenfranchised in the political system. You can vote for a party that represents you, but that party is not going to be elected,
Hmm.
no matter whether you vote for them or not. If you live in a neighborhood that reliably in the majority votes liberal or conservative, right? What people need to kind of like come around to is that they need to channel the sort of like disenchantment with the political process instead of kind of just falling asleep. They need to channel
Hmm.
that into getting involved, because that's the only way in which a society can defend itself against these austerity regimes that are essentially like a money grab.
I'm happy you're talking about austerity regimes again. I think there's the conversation is never over with them. This is something you sort of see from to kind of go a little more uh, 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 a higher level, a little more zoomed out. So something you see a lot from these kinds of right wing governments all across is an attack on educational institutions, right? Like I think you saw this with Bolsonaro in was it Brazil. You see
Yeah,
this, of course, with Trump in the States, and they see. I think one way I understand these things and this kind of attack on educational institutions is a lot of times like these universities aren't quite producing conservative voters, and if anything, I think maybe it even there's this idea that like being kind of the high level educated makes someone like again less likely to vote conservative. But I'm kind of curious what your take is on this
yeah.
kind of right wing attack on educational systems, and if you see this sort of if you understand the CAC doing that to the CEGEP system as part of the same kind of attack.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see kind of what we've been talking about so far is essentially a kind of wielding. The government has a couple of whips at its disposal, right? Governments and economic systems like capitalism, more broadly speaking, they sustain themselves with ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses, right? Either
After
it's
Sarah.
changing people's ideas or it's disciplining them. Austerity, what it is an economic whip, right? It's a way of economically disciplining workers, like public sector workers and society more broadly speaking, when you're coming after the right to strike, as with Bill 89. Those are austerity and Bill 89 are repressive tools of the government trying to discipline people in economic terms.
Mm-hmm.
What you have at the same time is, of course, the attack of education um, uh, is essentially two birds with one stone for the government. Because if you undereducate your population, as I said before with the United States, what it leads to is also people who simply do not have the tools or the vocabulary, or the language to organize and to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I pointed this similar thing out in one of my recent classes last fall, and one of my students sort of marveled at this realization that like attacking the education sector could have this kind of like negative effect and actually be beneficial for governments. And the student sort of raised their hand and looked at me and said, hold on a minute, like I'm just, it's just sinking in, because this is the first time that I'm hearing this, and I'm kind of concerned that like I'm hearing this for the first time in CEGEP. Shouldn't this be taught in high school? And I just looked at him and said, why do you think it isn't
Yeah,
taught
yeah.
in high school? And the student just sort of like leaned back, and you could just see that it kind of like clicked that there is a way in which these things actually interlock. And you're currently seeing it in the States and in Canada as well. In Canada, it's one of the ways in which it's happening similar to the United States is that current political organizing, especially around the Palestinian cause, is being weaponized. The right to protest is undermined in various ways. In Ontario recently, in Toronto, you've seen examples of
Mm-hmm.
that. I think
The
Mark
bubble
Carney
bylaw.
also has like a sort of like law that they're kind of like thinking about that is going to be problematic in terms of interfering with protests. Don't quote me on this. This is uh, like a meme or something that I saw on Instagram. So I forget which law exactly they were talking about, but it was a pro-Palestinian organization that was sort of reminding people that just because Carney won doesn't mean that you can kind of fall asleep now and
Mm-hmm.
just assume that things are going to get better. In the States, it takes two forms at the moment. You have, on the one hand, the weaponization of status, threatening people's ability to make a livelihood and remain in the
Mm-hmm.
country by deporting them over or by ending student visas because students are here from places like China that the US is currently in a trade war with, or be it deporting students that are slandered essentially as terrorism supporters.
Mm-hmm.
In Canada, it's less direct. Canada, for better or worse, likes to kind of like downplay these things and have carry them out with a bit more civil language, but that just makes them kind of more subtle, if nothing else. And
Yeah.
the subtle way in which the government is currently trying to undermine academic freedom in Quebec, for example, is of course the inquiry into Dawson and Vanier College over supposed tensions over anti-Semitism allegations that are unfounded. The tensions themselves have been, and this is like in the public record. You can look at what representatives of Dawson Teachers Union have, for example, said in response to Pascal Derry. Pascal Derry, this is how the inquiry started, said she had to intervene in the course content of one of the courses at one of these institutions. I forget which one. I think it was Dawson, because the tensions were getting out of hand at these institutions. What does Dawson Teachers Union respond? This is an outsider's perspective that is not reflective of what's actually going on at the college. Whatever is going on at the college is being handled by the administration and is being handled by the Dawson Teachers Union, the Dawson Student Union. All of these things are being negotiated as much as these things can in as civil as you can be in the context of the genocide in Gaza. These things are negotiated by the college. The outside interference was completely unwarranted and completely unnecessary, and that's why CEGEP unions across the system have come out in support of Dawson and Vanier and have called even for the resignation of Pascal Derry. Even CSN and FINEC and the professors organization in Quebec, I think as well, have come out in support of Dawson and Vanier and have called on Pascal Derry to resign. And most recently, Dawson Teachers Union itself passed a motion at the last General Assembly of the year calling for the resignation of Pascal Derry, partially because this is essentially an attack on academic freedom that is unprecedented, the way that they're undermining academic freedom, which is guaranteed by law in CEGEPs and universities in Quebec, and because of her own, what do you call it? When you have to excuse yourself from conflict of interest, because she used to be a board member of the Center for CEGEP, I think it's called, which is a recognized Israeli lobby group. And they were actually the ones, or one of the groups that were really involved in facilitating complaints directly to the education ministry rather than to Dawson. And they celebrated when the inquiry was announced and claimed it as a victory, which obviously, by any standard, makes this whole process highly problematic.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting that. I find this is the own little Quebecois version of the kind of anti-Palestinian, anti-student activism you see in the U.S., right? Where students who are either pro-Palestine, who have written about Palestine, or being either detained or abducted, right? So yeah, you're talking about this investigation. When did this start? This is earlier in February, right? Yeah, I mean, I think
it was announced in 2024, and then it sort of really took shape this year. But you can also tell, like, I mean, the fact that they're just ask you a question, then I have obviously a lot to say on the matter.
Of course. Well, I mean, I just wanted to me, I'm just making a little note of like the kind of like little similarities in this kind of thing about specifically about academic freedom, about freedom of speech. You know, this is like a common like touted kind of concept that's like people always claim to be in favor of. You know, especially I think that kind of a specific freedom of speech first thing always usually comes in, I would say, right wing circles, center right kind of circles, right? But there's a complete lack of that when it comes to this kind of stuff, right? Like, I mean, you saw with journalists, right? We had 2 journalists in Montreal over the last 2 years, who were arrested because of either Palestine reporting, being at a protest covering it, that they were arrested, and the officers didn't recognize them as journalists; they recognized them as activists just for covering something, right? That's a very serious line to have crossed as a police officer, right? As institutions representing the government, and here you have the government once again crossing that line and getting involved in things that is frankly none of their business. And frankly,
it's again along those lines exactly of disciplining institutions, because the reason why they're disciplining education and healthcare with economic policy is because they're scrambling to kind of cut budgets that they don't want to fix with the way that you would normally fix a budget, which is by increasing taxes on the rich and the wealthy, and large private corporations. The same thing is happening here. The education institutions are seen as not doing what they're supposed to be doing according to the standards of pro-business, capitalist, conservative government, because they're not fulfilling their role of the social reproduction of willing
Mm-hmm.
workers. They're being disciplined by being told, these are the things that you're supposed to be doing. These are the things you're not supposed to be doing. If you're not doing what we want you to do, we're going to come after you. This is shown too in the way that the inquiry is being executed. They've wrapped it up now. We might never find out what they find in this inquiry. And if anything, from what I've heard, the questions that they've been asking have very much been showing that they essentially went into it having made up their mind
Mm.
about what their conclusions are going to be. And the conclusions are very standard Quebec stuff. It's going to go along lines of secularism, which is essentially just another whistle way of activating Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism in Quebec. And so that's one part of it. And the other part of it is essentially a political crackdown on wokeness, radicalism, whatever else they are going to call it, because some of the questions were essentially along the lines of like, are you aware of anyone teaching any political things in CEGEP? Which is an insane question to ask, because everything is political.
Of course.
And as I tell my students at the beginning of the term of their applied themes class, I tell them, I tell them where my political position is, because I tell them anyone who pretends that they don't have a political position is either lying to you or worse, lying to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an insane way of framing it, and the same way like activating Islamophobia and essentially kind of marking Muslim students or student organizers out as targets, as scapegoats, is another way of disciplining not just teaching staff but also students through this inquiry.
It really shows you the kind of the level of leverage and reach that these Israel lobbies have, right? I mean, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, I just want to remind the viewers that this is not like a regular definition of anti-Semitism. Of course, anti-Semitism is a very serious issue. This is a very specific definition of anti-Semitism. I've had some members from Independent Jewish Voices come on the show to explain this kind of thing, but essentially, it's the IHRA definition of
Yeah,
anti-Semitism, and this is something that specifically equivocates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, right? This is now you have this thing where you have this idea of a nation state, right? And this is complete, and they're trying to make it completely synonymous with religion, with this kind of like identity, ethnic identity, or what have you. To be critical, to criticize Israel is to criticize
yeah.
Judaism, is to
And
criticize
the
Jewishness.
the IHRA definition, I think, has already been endorsed by the American Senate. I think
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of where the tendency in Canada is going as well. And it's the policy, or that definition itself is so problematic that I believe, from what I've read, like even the person who came up with the definition has since then sort of reneged and said this might not be the best way of utilizing this policy or fighting anti-Semitism. And activists from independent Jewish voices will, of course, point this out. So, same way in which it's pointed out by, for example, the professors, the Jewish professors who recently put out an open letter signed by members from across the CEGEP sector, from across universities in Quebec, Jewish faculty members who are saying this is not the way to fight anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
This is not the way to do it. This is a heavy-handed way that is ultimately just trying to do something very different than what it's officially telling people it's trying to do. Same with the economic policies.
Lots of stuff happening in our education sector. We see a lot of, I guess, the fallout from the wins by the workers from the Common Front strikes, as well as the continuing instrumentalization of identity by the Israel lobby, and how that is, of course, playing out at Dawson and other CEGEPs universities. Felix, I think that's going to be all for today. Thank you so much for
If I
coming
can
on.
just say one last thing,
Of
just
course.
to by way of wrapping up on this as well. I've been, as you've been wrapping up, I've just been reflecting on like talking about these issues here on your show, and having previously talked about it with you on your show. I'm just going to throw in there that I very recently became a Canadian citizen, and I'm still a very much a precarious worker. But if I had not gotten my citizenship, I would not be here talking about these things, because I would
Mm.
be afraid that that would give them leverage to come after me.
Hmm.
I would not be as comfortable talking about these issues if I didn't know that Dawson Teachers Union and the CSN and FNEC have my back. When I taught courses that I was in any way, shape, or form worried could kind of like face kind of like fight back from the government, I consulted with the FNEC lawyer. Like, these institutions are really helpful to secure people's livelihood and to really enrich the democratic process. Because if people are not comfortable speaking out about issues like this, that means you're not in a particularly healthy democracy. So, if anything, like I don't know if I'm like thanking the Canadian state here. I'm certainly
It
not
didn't
doing
sound
that,
like
but
that.
I'm just I'm basically, all I'm saying is that it's important to keep in mind that some people that would like to speak out about these issues cannot speak out about it because they're racialized, because they do not have status, or because they do not have secure employment and a union backing them up.
Well, thank you to these institutions that continue to make sure you have this bold voice and that you are continuing to speak your mind, and of course, coming onto my show to share your perspective on these very, very pressing matters.
Thank you for having me. I guess I'm sure I'll be back when the next round of cuts is announced.
Of course, it's I mean, probably might be soon. We'll see. Well,
Yeah.
I know if I see news about that, I'll definitely be hitting you up, Felix.
Thank you, Colin, for getting these things out there.
We gotta try. We gotta try.
Indeed.
There's a lot of stuff happening, but sometimes some of these stories are a little hidden, little not quite on the front page of news. But
Absolutely.
appreciate those words, Felix.
All right. Thank you. Take care.